slaveholder named Richard Dudley, having been refused by a young slave wife, quote unquote, and being urged thereto by her slave husband, ordered 2 stakes or posts to be driven deep into the earth in his barnyard. 2 of the strongest slaves on the plantation were compelled to perform this task. When the stakes were well driven, he commanded George and Caroline, quote unquote, man and wife, to be tied fast, 1 to each stake. The stakes were about 5 feet apart and 6 feet high. The victims had their hands tied together fast to the top of the post, so that they stood on tiptoe, and their feet were tied fast to the stake just above the ground. In this way their bodies were exposed to the keen lash of the whipper, a poor white vagabond called Robinson. The barnyard was filled with sad and unwilling spectators of the infamous scene, some slowly sauntering about, others looking gloomily on, and others still turning their faces away. While the preparations were being made for the execution of the sentence, the slaveholder continued to curse and upbraid Caroline with her obstinacy and disobedience in not acceding to his lustful desires. "I'll put an end to your fun," he said. "I'll make it a dear job for you both," he continued. Meanwhile poor Caroline was overcome with terror. Every now and then her unhappy husband would address her in an undertone, in words of consolation and encouragement, but he dared not to speak so as to be heard by his master, else his sympathy would excite his rage still more. Caroline, who was as white and as good-looking as any woman in the state, was strung up high against the posts with her back to the whipper. Her chemise, a light cotton one, afforded no protection to the heavy blows of the whip. "Begin now," shouted the slaveholder, while he stood back some yards, placing his arms akimbo and leisurely taking a survey of the scene. Robinson stepped up, took his stand at the requisite distance from his victims, raised his whip, swung the long and heavy lash scientifically around him several times, and brought it down with such force upon the back of poor Caroline that it seemed to jar and shatter her whole frame. Instantly the blow extorted from her a loud and long scream of agony, which rent the air and appalled every listener, and she writhed in intense pain. But Robinson was well used to such things. Her awful scream did not engross his attention for an instant, and he returned to repeat the exploit upon the more vigorous frame of his other victim. He cut and carved his broad back and shoulders scientifically, and exerted his utmost strength to make the blow tell upon him. George did not move, yet he could not but utter one deep groan of suffering, forced upon him by the pain which the blow inflicted. Next came Caroline's turn. The same blow, the same scream, so heart-rending and affecting, were repeated. But Robinson paused not in his work. He had no time to lose. It would be night before his task was ended, and he had to hurry himself. Fast and thick the blows fell upon the 2 slaves. George gave but little proof of his sufferings. Caroline, long before 100 blows had been dealt her, had ceased to scream or to wail, but hung insensible by her hands to the post which sustained her lacerated body. And long before her 250 lashes had been given, not only her chemise had been cut to pieces by the thong of Robinson's whip, but her whole back was cut into deep gashes. Blood flowed plentifully down her person, and every time the lash touched her body it sank deeply into the soft, mashed, lacerated flesh. Caroline had already ceased to feel. She was for a few moments beyond the power of her master's rage. She had fainted. But by the slaveholder's order she was untied from the stake, and several of the elder slaves carried her insensible body back to the hut, where they left her to recover as best she might. As they were afraid to offer her any assistance, lest they themselves might excite the wrath of their master. George still remained tied to the stake. He had yet 150 blows to endure. As Robinson resumed his bloody task, the poor wretch could endure it no longer, and broke out in earnest supplication. "Oh, Master Richard, don't whip me any more. I'm most gone," he said frantically. Lay it on the scoundrel. Lay it on." Richard, "Oh," he said frantically. "Lay it on the scoundrel. Lay it on," Richard peremptorily commanded Robinson, who obeyed him with alacrity. The body of George was by this time covered with scars, cuts, and welts. The blood flowed freely. His sobs and groans alternated with the heavy blows of Robinson's whip. By the time his allotted 400 lashes had been inflicted, the flesh hung in stripes from his bones. George, too, had fainted. His nature, strong and vigorous as it was, had sunk beneath the agony of the fierce struggle between fiendish wrath on the one hand and enduring constancy on the other. 400 lashes had been told, and Robinson's execrable work had been done. George's body was covered with blood. The slaveholder approached him and examined his wounds, while Robinson stepped back to sit down upon a log and rest himself. The slaveholder, seeing the loose flesh hanging in stripes from George's lacerated back, took his jackknife from his pocket, and amid the screams of his victim, just returning again to consciousness, cut off the stripes of flesh and threw the pieces to the hogs in the barnyard, which ate them with avidly. Then he commanded George to be untied. The poor wretch fell immediately to the earth. He could not stand, and moaning in his great agony, he too was carried to his quarters among the slave huts. That would be on pages 196 to 199 in the old book that I have linked in the description bar.